I came in thinking, oh, this is a Western, right? It's a cowboy game, quote unquote. From the advertising, from the sort of, marketing of this game, I just thought it was a Western. And then suddenly it's in the Deep South in 1899 at this really pivotal moment in Southern history. I was trained as a Southern historian in so many ways. And my eyes are just kind of going wide, like, wow, millions of people across the world are engaging with this time and place through this game. And I wondered, well, what are professional historians doing to kind of pick up on this enthusiasm and passion that so many millions of people are now getting from this game? Of the top 10 best-selling video games of all time, there's only one historical game on the list, and that's Red Dead Redemption 2.
Welcome to Heroes Behind Headlines. I'm your host, Ralph Pizzullo. Our guest today is professor and author Tore Olsson to talk about his fascinating new book, Red Dead's History, a video game, an obsession, and America's violent past. Tore is both an American history buff and a video game enthusiast. One of his favorite games is Red Dead Redemption 2, which is set in a fictionalized America of 1899. The game follows the Vanderlyn Gang, a diverse crew of idealistic outlaws, as they flee authority in an increasingly ordered and hierarchical world. Since its release in 2018, the game has sold more than 64 million copies, making it seventh on the list of all-time best-selling video games and the only historically themed one on the list. It covers topics including corporate capitalism, settler colonialism, women's suffrage, and systems of racial inequity in the post-Civil War South. While playing the game in 2020, Tore had an epiphany. Given how wildly popular this game was with college-age Americans, why not try teaching a serious history course that used the fictional content of the game as a springboard to jump into some of the thorniest dilemmas of the American past? The result has been a widely popular course he teaches at the University of Tennessee and his new book, Red Dead's History. It's my great honor to welcome history professor and author Tore Olsson as today's hero behind the headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines with Ralph Pizzullo.
My name is Tore Olsson, and I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Tennessee. And I've held this position for the past 11 years. So I've, been in the academic business for a little while now. And I work on American history. I work on American history since the Civil War, especially. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a strange undertaking for me, if you knew a little bit about my personal background, which is the fact that I'm not an American. I'm Swedish originally. I was born and raised in Sweden and emigrated to the United States when I was just 8 years old. At the urging, or my parents made that decision. It was not me.
Right.
We came over and I grew up in Massachusetts and got really interested as a kid in American history.
Interesting.
In part because it was just so strange and otherworldly, knowing so little about it in Sweden. I think it was especially the sort of Civil War era, this a nation tearing itself apart over these big social questions about these divisions between North and South that really intrigued me, as it does so many millions of other people, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Yeah.
And I got really interested in American history and then went to college and decided that, hey, I do well in these classes. They make me excited. So let's be a history major. And then by the time I'm concluding that my college years, I'm thinking, well, I love school. I'm happy to keep doing this. So I chose the path of least resistance in some senses and continued on to do a PhD in history, which I did at the University of Georgia. And it was being down in Georgia for 8 years doing my PhD that I got especially interested in Southern history.
Yeah.
And living in the midst of that, and definitely not being a Southerner, right? I mean,
Yeah.
really a Swedish Yankee above all,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Not even an American, and then certainly not a Southerner within the U.S. I got really intrigued by Southern history, and I spent a lot of my career since then working at that. And of course, now I teach in Tennessee in the midst of the South,
Hmm.
and a lot of my work engages the South, though, of course, other regions too. And for this project on Red Dead Redemption 2, I got especially immersed in Western history, which is
Yeah.
a topic I'd always been interested in, had read a lot on,
Right.
but got to learn a lot of new stuff as well for that. So that's kind of who I am and
Hmm.
where I come from. I'm an academic, but I'm also really interested in writing and reaching audiences outside of the academic world, which really
Good for you.
does help to explain the sort of origins of this strange book.
Let's talk about the origins of this book, because it has to do with your love of video games as well,
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So
which a lot of people love these days and are very involved in.
it's a very, emotionally affecting hobby,
Hmm.
to be sure. So I grew up as a video game kid, to be sure. Right. I mean, spent, come of age in the 1990s after having moved from Sweden. And, what raised me in this country were video games,
Yeah.
a whole range of them. In many ways, the 1990s was especially golden period for PC gaming, not exclusively, but the PC gaming world was especially vibrant in the kind of age of StarCraft and Half-Life and Wolfenstein and Doom and many of these franchises that are still kicking around today. So I very much was a video game kid.
Hmm.
But once I got to college, I came to realize that my obsession with video games was not doing me any favors.
Uh-huh.
Certainly not socially, because I didn't have that many friends who I didn't see behind a screen,
Yeah.
and certainly not academically either. I'll confess, I squeaked out of high school with a 2.7 GPA, it mainly due to the fact that I was up late playing video games many evenings. So I really quit video games in 2000
Hmm.
when I went to college and got serious about history, got serious about studies, writing, about reading,
Uh-huh.
and really took 20 years off from video games. Like I really had like a long hiatus from that field until the strange turn of the COVID-19 pandemic
Yeah.
brought me back in. Right. So in 2020, I rediscover this hobby, kind of buy a new computer and begin trying to, dip my toes back in. Of course, I can never dive in the way I had in high school. I have a job, I have young children. It's not the same world, to be sure. And I'm, generally a more thoughtful and serious person at that point than I was in 1997, to be sure. But yeah, so for the past 4 years, I have been
Yeah.
playing games
Sure.
as a hobby. So it all started as a hobby, right? The idea was,
Yeah.
oh, I got to pass the time during lockdown. I mean, once my
Right.
kids go to bed,
Right.
there's only so many TV episodes you can watch. What am I going to do, right? So I decided to get back into games. And one of the very first games that I played, which I picked up exclusively for fun, like I had no professional intentions behind it,
Hmm.
is I picked up this recent blockbuster hit, Red Dead Redemption 2.
Yeah.
I really just picked it up because I heard it had great graphics and great storytelling, and it was an open world game. I like open world games. And I don't think the history bit had anything to do with me picking it up. I mean, it was not, I did not, ever, in the first weeks of playing with this game, it was just part of the hobby. It was not for professional pursuits.
Right.
That changed, though. That changed about 20 hours into the game
Hmm.
when I start recognizing that, this game it's not stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it's fictionalized. The names of most people and places are made up, and it's certainly way too violent than anything that actually happened in US history. So,
Right.
certain parts of it are bizarrely unrealistic. But then I was really impressed as a professional historian playing the game and recognizing how somewhat frequently the game would allude to major dilemmas in American history of the kind of late 19th and early 20th century.
Hmm.
The game would usually not flesh them out or grant a ton of context,
Yeah.
but the fact that the game gave a significant amount of space to topics like the women's suffrage movement, to the role of corporate capitalism as this kind of new force transforming America, to the Pinkerton Detective Agency, to systems of racial inequality in the South.
Hmm.
And indeed, I've already mentioned that I was trained as a Southern historian in so many ways. I think when I realized that the game also engaged the South,
Yeah.
right? I think I came in thinking, oh, this is a Western, right? It's a cowboy game, quote
Yeah.
unquote.
From the title, you think,
Yeah, I mean, from the advertising, from the sort of, marketing of this game,
right.
I just thought it was a Western. And then suddenly it's in the Deep South in 1899 at this really pivotal moment in Southern history. And my eyes are just kind of going wide, like, wow, this is like
Yeah.
millions of people across the world are engaging with this time and place through this game.
Yeah.
And I wondered, well, what are we historians, what are professional historians doing to kind of pick up on this enthusiasm and passion
Hmm.
that so many millions of people are now getting from this game? And I realized when I checked into this in 2020 that we historians had done very little,
Yeah.
right? That we'd kind of stayed at arm's length from the video game world in general,
Hmm.
which is interesting because historians have used pop culture very frequently in teaching, even in writing, books, TV shows, novels,
Hmm.
and films, and all that.
Yeah.
But I think there has been a hesitancy to include video games as sort of serious pop culture worth engaging. And I understand why. I mean, there's a lot of the negative stereotypes about gaming are there for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
not just invented.
Right.
That, this imagined sort of, white male toxic misogynist space, like, yeah, that's a real thing.
Hmm.
It's not the entirety of the gaming industry today, to be sure, but it has historical origins, and there's some truth to this. So historians have been relatively, slow in engaging video games as a place where people encounter history.
Hmm.
So I thought I'd try an experiment,
Yeah.
and it really just started. It started with a class,
Yeah.
because I teach a good bit as part of my job. I love teaching; it's a fun part of my job. So I had this idea about 20 hours into Red Dead Redemption 2. Why not try teaching a course that revolves around the fictional content of this game, this
Yeah.
hugely popular game that
Yeah.
sold more than 60 million copies at this point.
Wow.
It's in the top 10 of best-selling video games ever, right? It's sitting there alongside Minecraft and Tetris and things like this, right? And what's really fascinating is that of the top 10 best-selling video games of all time, there's only one historical game on the list, and that's Red Dead Redemption 2.
Hmm.
So I'm recognizing while playing this game a few years ago that this is a juggernaut that so many millions of college-aged people,
Yeah.
and just people in general, but certainly college-aged people, it's a sort of reference point for them that
Sure.
they think of when they imagine late 19th century American history.
It's almost calling to you, right? It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, we got to engage in
And
this.
it's fun for me, like I enjoy the gaming medium. This is part of my background and my sort of hobbies.
Right.
So it kind of checked many boxes for me.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, so the plan back then was to launch this experimental class that used the fictional content of the games mainly as a hook, right? Like as a sort of, lure,
Yeah.
and as a, jumping off point to then have serious, real conversations about questions of violence in the South, in the West, in the, basically 50 years after the Civil War, kind of 1865 to 1920 period.
Hmm.
So that was the idea behind the class. And in 2021, it launched for the first time.
And did well.
Did well.
Yeah. No, it's a brilliant idea.
It was tricky because it was still in the midst of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So kind of getting word out on campus was quite difficult,
Uh-huh.
given the fact that many students were just like shacked up in their dorms and doing everything on Zoom.
Right.
So actually, I took to social media and tried to publicize the class there. And it had success greater than I could have imagined.
Hmm.
Because it wasn't just UT students that learned about this. It was hundreds of thousands of people around the world
Yeah.
who loved the idea that, oh, wow, a college class might take this popular game and then use it as a teaching tool.
Yeah.
So we got that first publicity about the class, like it got covered on GameSpot, which is one of the major gaming news publications.
Right.
And then suddenly, I found that like there were people on the internet who were writing in Spanish, Chinese, Arabic about this class, right? So I knew that I'd kind of touched somewhat of a live wire, that there was a great deal of interest in that.
In the February 2010 article in GameSpot that Tore just referred to, he explained that the course he was designing based on Red Dead Redemption 2 wouldn't require owning the game on PC console, though he would assume that most of the students will have played the game before. And in a subsequent tweet, he explained that he hoped the unorthodox handling of history would help attract students from non-history majors. Tore also hoped that his class would inspire other professors to think about game-oriented classes that'll appeal more to young students than a traditional syllabus might. In your class, and now extended into your book, you're basically looking at the game and talking about sort of the social and historical context of the game, and then comparing it to reality and sort of filling in the gaps for people who play the game.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, at its very simplest, and this is not the entirety of the project of the book, but
Yeah.
at its very simplest, it is an evaluation of, how decent of a historical job does Red Dead Redemption 2 do in capturing late 19th and early 20th century America. So I do evaluate the game in that, but more often than not, more of the book is spent kind of filling in the gaps that the game doesn't even try to provide. So it's not just a tally of what's right and what's wrong.
Right.
Often it's a tally of like what's missing and what would be unrealistic for us to even expect the game to provide. But that really helps to explain the broader dilemmas of the time.
Yeah. What is the major overall theme that comes out of this exploration?
Yeah. Well, I really wanted to foreground the question of violence.
Yeah.
Knowing that Red Dead Redemption 2 is a violent game that, has very high body counts, digital body counts to be sure. And also given a lot of Americans sort of stereotype assumption that, the late 19th century West and South were these violent places.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to address head on that question of violence to see, well, what does that mean? How true was that or not?
Mm-hmm.
Even though the body counts are wildly inflated in the game does get at a very true and real conclusion about late 19th century America, which is that it's an unusually violent time. Mm-hmm. It's a time when, there's a lot of homicide and murder and bloodshed taking place.
Yeah.
But the question is, why is that violence taking place?
Right.
So the game, when it provides an answer to that question of why is violence taking place, it's usually a fairly simple answer about the pursuit of personal gain,
mm-hmm.
right? Like bank robberies,
right.
train robberies, like personal enrichment and the push for it. That's mainly the engine of violence, right? The guards will fire back when you rob a place.
Right.
Or the game shows that violence erupted because of these personal grudges and rivalries. Or, people drink too much whiskey and they're playing poker and whatnot. So kind of, like the classic Western film explanations for violence.
Right.
And sure, I'm not trying to say that those things didn't happen,
mm-hmm.
but they're really a drop in the bucket compared to the big picture taking place, the big engine of violence in this moment, which are really two dilemmas. And my book is really about these two dilemmas. There's two dilemmas that are really spurring bloodshed in late 19th and early 20th century America. And the first of these has to do with corporate capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So you and I have both grown up and lived in an era where massive corporations dominate American life.
Yes.
However, Americans in the 1870s and 80s are not used to that.
Yeah.
They're seeing those corporations emerge for the very first time.
Right.
And they're really uneasy and uncertain about whether that's a good thing or not.
Yeah.
And there's a tremendous amount of resistance and pushback on both sides. I mean, the corporations will wield violence and regular people will wield violence against these outside powerful interests.
Yeah.
So a lot of my book goes to show that, especially in the West, in Appalachia, a lot of the bloodshed that results in this period is really fighting about big business and what the place of big business would be in regular people's lives.
After the Civil War, this was a new battle.
Yeah.
So it was a very active thing. And people had this idea of the independent American blazing their path into the future and getting a piece of land. And suddenly you come across these gangs. Very, very interesting. And also it shows how so much of the narrative was set back then and kind of hid these big interests.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we've erased a lot of this conflict from the storytelling, from the stories that we tell about the West, about Appalachia. We kind of stripped a lot of the economic contests out of it because it's an easier and more neatly packaged sort of Disneyfied version of the past to tell. But, we think about Jesse James or Wild Bill Hickok. Oh, they're just these, gunslingers out fighting,
Right.
in this kind of unchanging West. Who knows why they're fighting? Well, the lives of both of those two outlaws. Well,
Yeah.
Hickok's not quite an outlaw, but he's
Yeah.
the gunslinger to be sure. They're really revolved around questions of money and big business and where they stood on the expansion of large corporate capitalists in the West or in the South as well. So it's like they're not firing bullets at people at random. It's all infused by this massive dilemma of, what should be the power of Wall Street
Yeah.
businesses
Yeah.
in people's lives in Missouri, in Nebraska, in Kansas, in places like that. And that, people had very different reactions to that question.
Right.
There was no sort of unanimity or consensus among regular Americans. It was just as it is today, right? I mean, today we fight about what should be the power of big corporations in our lives. But back then, given that those companies were so new and the scale of them was so new, no one really knew how this was going to wind up.
Right. And the story wasn't told that way.
Yeah.
So it was basically this story of, settlers trying to work things out and deal with hostile Native Americans. And you don't think of it in terms of them resisting these big corporate interests who are looking at this as just like another economic opportunity to take advantage of. I don't know if it was the 70s, there was a movie, Heaven's Gate, that came out about the Johnson County War.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it to be fascinating, and it deals exactly with this same theme. But it was so foreign, I think, to people at the time. This wasn't what they expected from a Western, that they didn't know how to receive it.
Right.
But the depiction, I found it very moving, and it seemed to me to make perfect sense. And as you talk about it in your book, that was the reality.
Yeah, and I do think the Johnson County War in particular provided a decent bit of inspiration for Red Dead Redemption 2, in that it takes place in the 1890s, so it's in that same kind of period. And it's really a battle between large-scale ranchers in Wyoming and smaller-scale cowboys who wanted to kind of strike out for themselves and get their own, start in the ranching industry. And the big scale ranchers band together and begin fighting against these. It's really a class conflict, and I think generally Americans are uncomfortable talking about class.
Yes.
There's this sort of national ethos that, we're all middle class here, when that's so far from the truth. So in narrating the West, I think this sort of like this myth of the Wild West, the way we tell those stories often, it strips out the class divisions that really fueled what happened there, plus the racial divisions too, but certainly the class divisions.
Mm-hmm.
And just because it's a harder story to tell, and it's one that's, more divisive and more polarizing, but it's actually what happened.
Right.
Now, I do like, we haven't talked about the games all that much recently, but I do like that Red Dead Redemption 2, even though it doesn't give full depth and sensitivity to these kinds of class issues, it does pay at least lip service to the power of some of these big Eastern capitalists. And the game has one sort of robber baron that dominates much of the story. This guy, Leviticus Cornwall,
Mm-hmm.
who's in railroads, who's in mining, who's in ranching, who's in sugar business, which is all entirely, realistic. That
Right.
people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, they had their fingers in a lot of different pies at the time. So the game does kind of gesture toward these divisions and tensions, but there's certain things in the game that are just basically absent, like the labor movement, right? Like unions.
Right.
You don't hear much at all about unions in the game,
Mm-hmm.
while in the actual West of the 1880s and 90s, there were a whole lot of fights about unions.
Mm-hmm.
Even cowboys tried to form labor unions, right? That's something that we don't think about hardly ever.
And in terms of cowboys, you show that most cowboys were working for these large corporate interests. So they weren't just these sort of independent guys seeking their own destiny on the Great Plain. They were corporate soldiers, basically.
Yeah, and they didn't necessarily love that, they didn't love being under the thumb
That part of it.
of big business,
Right.
but they were.
Yeah.
That's one of the most powerful myths of American history
Yeah.
that I even learned as like a kid in Sweden in the 1980s. It's like
Sure.
the image of America is this independent, free-spirited cowboy riding into the sunset, a man, a man of his own making.
Yeah.
And the cowboy is just not that.
Yeah.
The cowboy is a wage worker for some of the biggest corporate interests in America, whether it's the ranches or whether it's the meatpacking industry that's headquartered in Chicago. It's like they are pawns in a much larger corporate game.
Yeah.
And we've stripped all of that out when we tell the sort of John Wayne version of, this guy on his own.
Yeah.
And it's not true.
One point that you make that I found really interesting was that the Native American societies were changing as well. Particularly the introduction of horses and guns really radicalized their tribes in the West. And also how these tribes were not united, which is really what led to their downfall. And there were people within the different Native American tribes who were trying to say, hey guys, the white man's coming. This onslaught of people is headed this way. If we don't group together and unite, we're going to get overrun. And that is something that is very rarely talked about.
Yeah, American society likes to tell very simplistic stories about Native peoples.
Yeah.
Whether it poses them as positive or negative, they're simplistic, right? That they're people living in traditional ways, who've been there forever, who would, they're all basically the same from Massachusetts to Nevada to California. And all of those stories are absolute fabrication.
Yeah.
There's so much diversity and difference between different native nations, right?
Yeah.
Different languages and lifestyle differences too. And like you noted, Ralph, they're changing very actively because in the 200 years or so before the kind of big conflicts of the 1870s, 1880s, when you have the introduction of horses and guns, it really not every native tribe is changed as a result of it, but many are, especially on the Great Plains.
Yeah.
Especially on the northern and southern plains, right? So from the Comanche and the Kiowa on the southern plains to the Lakota, particularly on the northern Great Plains, folks really move away from settled intensive agriculture and toward extensive nomadism built around the bison, right? I mean, like in, let's say, 1400 or so, the bison, of course, is there, but it doesn't play as important of a role in native society among the Lakota, for example.
Yeah.
But by, like 1800, it's totally different that native northern Great Plains societies had really retooled themselves in order to hunt this one animal whose population had grown as the weather had changed, and who's now, with horses and guns, it's much more possible to sustain yourself on that.
Right.
So any idea that, like native peoples are just living in this sort of unchanging, frozen in amber nature is really misrepresents what was going on.
And then within a couple decades, they were living on reservations, basically.
Yeah, I would say that the real decade that's the tipping point is the 1870s, which is what's so strange about Red Dead Redemption 2, because it's a game that's set in 1899, and it does, in the later chapters of the game, feature this very large military confrontation between this fictional native group that's probably modeled on the Lakota and the U.S. Army. And in 1899, that would have been completely unrealistic, right?
Yeah.
It would have been much more realistic in 1868 or in 1872 or something like that. But by 1899, I mean, the U.S. Army has really, there's a stalemate. I mean, it's a very bitter and nasty stalemate that's resulted. But U.S. Army and white settlers have been, the military victors in that battle.
Yeah.
So that would have been, really hard. And this is one of the great sort of ironies of Red Dead Redemption 2, is that it is a quite a historically thoughtful game, but it tends to very often showcase 1870s dilemmas much more than 1899 dilemmas.
Yeah.
Like I joke that Red Dead 2 is a pretty great game about like 1871.
Yeah.
Except it's set like almost 30 years afterward.
Right.
And it gets very strange. There's some strange context that would not have, I mean, like the Ku Klux Klan is featured in the southern parts there is essentially no Ku Klux Klan in the South in 1899. It's been driven underground, but it was very pronounced in 1871, for example.
Yeah. And then as soon as sort of things were pacified in the West, then the railroads showed up.
Well, the railroads come before.
Okay.
I think the railroads are a crucial part. First of all, there's no pacification, right? I mean, this is really violent through and through. But the domination of Native peoples is very much accomplished with the railroads as sort of part of the lead. Because, bison hunters are coming in on railroad cars. The U.S. Army is coming in on railroad cars.
Right.
I don't think these wars would have looked the way they did if there had been no railroads. Of course, more railroads come afterward.
Mm-hmm.
But 1869 is the year that the first transcontinental is finished, right, in 1869. And it's in the next, 10 years that the tide really tips in favor of the U.S. Army over native nations.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the railroad is how fast it spread, how profound the effect was, and also how the government was really helping the corporate interests, right?
Yeah.
Which we still see in our society.
But we like to ignore, and I think as a result of the Cold War, which is a separate subject, obviously, but like during the Cold War, the United States liked to tell itself, we're a free market country, like the Soviets have a big government that's involved in the economy, but we operate under free enterprise capitalism.
Yeah.
That's just not true historically or today, but it's certainly not true in the late 1800s when the US government is giving so many favors and privileges and land to big companies, especially the railroads, right? I mean, one of the most fascinating facts that I dug up in this book, I borrowed from another scholar, which is exactly how much land the U.S. government gave to the railroads.
Astounding.
The thought exercise to me that's very striking is that if you took all this land and you put it together in one place and you made it a state, it would be the third largest state in the country after Alaska and Texas.
Wow.
Right? Like, this is a huge amount of land just given out to big businesses who then use it to enrich themselves and totally change the structure of the American economy.
Right. And that is not commonly known, and I don't think it's taught in most history classes.
Yeah, because it contradicts Americans' sense of self.
Yeah.
That the government has no role in the economy. Well, it's always been there. Government intervention in the economy is not the same for every group.
No.
Certain groups get much more benefit than others.
Absolutely.
And generally, the government has paid much more attention and given many more resources to the rich rather than to the poor.
Right.
And no one highlighted this fact better than Martin Luther King Jr. Because in 1968, the same year that he was assassinated, King declared that the problem with America is that we have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. And that is exactly what played out in late 19th century America, right? Like these governments just showering land and benefits on the railroads.
Yeah.
That's socialism for the rich,
right?
Right? Are the cowboys getting any of that?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The cowboys get tossed the leftovers of free market capitalism, which is a pretty hard pill to swallow sometimes.
And you see that in every region. So the next region you sort of cover is the South.
Right, which gets at the second dilemma, the kind of, so I introduced the first dilemma, what's really driving violence, capitalism. Well, the second dilemma, which is very much a Southern story, is this unfulfilled promise of racial equality.
Yeah.
Right, that during Reconstruction, during these pivotal years after the Civil War, the United States, right, totally kind of reframes the founding documents of this country and says, hey, like people other than white men maybe should have a chance at shaping the society, right?
Yeah.
And particularly extends this to black men in the South. And then the amount of violence that is uncorked by that promise and by its lack of fulfillment is really profound.
Mm-hmm.
There's, so much of the bloodshed that takes place in the post-Civil War decades in the South are related to this promise and to its lack of fulfillment.
Yeah.
And the game kind of gestures toward that. I mean, not enough. They should have done more, but they do enough to like start a conversation about it.
Violence was endemic in the South from the end of the Civil War onwards. The Freedmen's Bureau in Texas kept a register of murders and recorded over 1,000 in 1965 through 1966. And they tried to give a reason for each one, such as, quote, black man didn't tip his hat, so I shot him. Historian Eric Foner calls it a sign of the instability of the whole racial system in the South, and the fact that people were claiming new rights and others were resisting them. Then with radical Reconstruction came political violence. Organized groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White League in Louisiana, and the Knights of the White Camellia, whose purpose was to obstruct and destroy Reconstruction government, to assassinate or intimidate black and white Republican officials, and to use violence to prevent people from voting. Historian Clarence Walker called it a war of terror, aimed at not only the suppression of black voters and black politicos, but also at whites deemed to be, quote, race traitors. Any association with the Republican Party put one at risk of being shot or lynched or having your house set on fire, even if you were white. One thing that you pointed out that I think every American needs to think about is the one drop rule.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just bizarre. It makes no sense when you think of it in practical terms, but it was kind of the rule, and we still sort of think that way.
Yeah, it's still, that shadow still hangs over American society, right? Which leads us into these weird places that, like, why is it that according to conventional American thinking, that a white woman, quote unquote, can give birth to a quote unquote black child, but a black woman cannot give birth to a white child? Like, why, how is that a thing?
Yeah.
Right? So there's, like, there's origins of this way of thinking. And if you look at where it comes from, well, it makes us very embarrassed to still be using some of this stuff because it's all really quite nasty. I'm kind of proudest, and I mean, I love many of the chapters of this book, and
Yeah.
The origins in the class. But I am perhaps proudest of this chapter about race as an idea, because this is a very hard thing for Americans to discuss, no matter what your background is.
Right.
And it's a conversation that we prefer to push under the rug.
Right.
And it's one that's, highly politicized, and there's big debates today about what you can and can't teach and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that this video game, Red Dead Redemption 2, could actually be a really powerful tool for having an open and candid conversation about race, because I think the game approaches it in a fairly nuanced and sensitive manner.
Some really ugly things happen, but it's important to understand why they happened and what was behind it. And again, you go back to these large economic forces.
Yeah, right. They're a crucial part of it. Yeah, and it's interesting. I've found both in the class and then with the book too, I think there's this sort of, that invoking this popular video game to talk about these hard questions of race can sometimes have this sort of disarming quality to it, that it's sort of, I don't know, it has a way of bringing people together. Like, because what I love about video games in general is that they have such a diverse fan base. I mean, there's socialists and there's, MAGA Trumpies, who all love this game. Like, it's a common ground that, like, everyone can agree on. Not everyone. Some people don't like it, to be sure. But, like, there's people from across the political spectrum who love this game, to be sure.
Right.
And it, using this kind of common pop culture sort of phenomenon can be an interesting and accessible way to start those hard conversations about race. So it's very much what I'm trying to do in part with the book.
Right. No, I think you do it very effectively. And it's interesting because video games are sort of played through the lens of a player, of a character. And I think when you look at history that way, when you see it on that human level, on that individual level of how they're dealing with these different issues, it becomes much more personal and less political ideas and ideologies. It's like, how does an individual deal with these circumstances, right? And you talk about that in the context of the end of the Civil War and how not only was the South devastated and deeply ashamed of what had happened, but the war was fought also on a class level.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who fought the war were generally poor people.
Right.
And at the end of the war, they were still poor.
Poorer.
And the one thing that you brought out that struck me was that a lot of the big plantations continued.
Oh, yeah.
So the economic system didn't change, really. In fact, it got worse.
It changes in some ways. I mean, the end of slavery is an important milestone that definitely should not be understated.
Right.
But you're right. Plantations, they don't just remain, they expand. Cotton production not just remains, dramatically expands. So much so that by 1900, the South is producing 3 times as much cotton as it did in 1860,
Yeah.
right? Which is like, you think about, in grade school, you learn about King Cotton and you think about, 1850s, 1860s.
Yeah.
No, like 1910, that's like King Cotton's true peak of power, which is pretty baffling to consider. So, yes, there's a lot of continuities between the so-called Old South and the New South, and then some important changes. But yeah, exploitation, whether along the lines of race or class, remain, foundations of Southern society. But to me, that's sort of among white Southerners, that class distinction is something that not enough people recognize.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, first, the fact that only about 30% of white Southerners before the Civil War owned enslaved people, right? That only about 30% of whites were actually direct participants in the institution of slavery. And then that the war itself is very much a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
Yeah.
That's the kind of classic saying of the war, that, started by rich planters, and they're the ones who stand the most to benefit from it. But the folks, the foot soldiers, the people in the sort of, in the trenches, if you will, are often poor whites who did not. Some own slaves, to be sure, but many don't. And many find that the war is really disastrous for them and destroys the sort of small scale livelihoods that they'd had beforehand. Now, I should say that, not owning enslaved people did not make them anti-racists or anything like that. I mean, racism is still a powerful factor, whether or not you owned enslaved people or not.
It's interesting that even though the war, the North was victorious and the Union stayed together, and there were political changes that were then resisted in the South, but the economic system did not really change. It was still in place.
Yeah.
And since it was still in place, the South really couldn't progress because of that.
The folks who had land and power before the war were often the same folks who had land and power after the war.
Right.
I mean, you have some of the same office holders,
Right.
who were Democratic elected officials in 1850, who are Confederates in 1863, who are then Democrats in 1880,
Yeah.
which is, pretty wild to think about. And that gets at another sort of simple but truthful declaration that, that the United States, or the North, if you will, they win the war, but they lose the peace.
Yeah.
In that Reconstruction, the sort of, attempt to remake the South does not achieve what many had hoped that it would. So many of the old power brokers are still in office, still running the show.
And then they sort of invent these systems to sort of extend their power and their racial control over the South. And one of them that we've all seen examples of were the chain gangs.
Right.
What a horrible institution that was.
Yeah.
But really used for economic means.
Absolutely.
For racial control and economic means.
Yeah. And this is another place where Red Dead Redemption 2 provides a perfect opportunity to have a discussion about chain gang labor, about the convict lease system.
Yeah.
Because the game very frequently, in the South at least, showcases and displays, these chain gangs that are wearing these striped uniforms. They're bound with, metal chains. But what's interesting is the game, they're kind of like a biracial institution. Like, it's half whites, half blacks, it's kind of balanced based on the population. And in reality, there were white convicts, to be sure, but they were like 10%. And, 80, 90% are African Americans, which, gets at those kinds of continuities, that this chain gang system is really a, kind of naked attempt to replicate slavery in slightly different form.
Yeah. And you talk about this case of Green Cottonham, young guy picked up for a minor infraction.
I think it was vagrancy, which is it's a law that doesn't, it means basically being visibly unemployed.
Yeah.
Like being in a place and not having proof of your employment and just like not doing anything. Loitering, vagrancy, these laws were militarized in really, really, draconian fashion right after the Civil War.
Yeah.
In order to snap up, poor people and put them to work, especially poor Black people, and put them to work in, some of the industries that were, changing the South, whether it was coal mining or railroad construction or anything like that.
And they weren't getting paid at all.
No, I mean, this was unfree labor in every way, shape, and form.
And in his case, basically worked to death. Within a year, he was dead.
Right, and he was like 23 or something, right? I mean, it's a guy like in the prime of his life who dies of tuberculosis in a coal mine.
In the toxic environment of the post-Civil War South, The mostly white authorities thought that chain gangs could kill two birds with one stone. They would relieve overcrowding in prisons and help restore the South's infrastructure. But the thought of putting a white prisoner in chains and having them work in the blistering sun was called, quote, an intolerable inversion of a divinely ordained social hierarchy. The authorities put thousands of black men in chains and congratulated themselves for it. One convict labor advocate, Joseph Hyde Park, even said, life in the convict road camp is more conducive to maintaining and building up the general health and manhood of the convict than when he is confined behind prison walls. One of the most interesting areas of the book was Appalachia, because we have this very strongly ingrained sense of Appalachia as this really backward area with uneducated, inbred people. And we make fun of that. You see it reflected in countless movies and TV shows. And when you get into Appalachia, again, you see how big business, big corporate exploitation is really the story of what happens there and how the region is transformed.
Yeah. And this is a subject that's very personally meaningful to me because I live in East Tennessee. You know, I teach in Appalachia. I have many students here. I'm not from the region, right? I'm a total outsider. I mean, I've lived here for more than a decade, but many of my students would, consider themselves Appalachian. So these are stereotypes that many of them have confronted during a great deal of their lives.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, the simple sort of the hillbilly stereotype that we always hear is that, oh, Appalachia, is this poor and backward place because it's isolated, it's disconnected.
Yeah.
It's, not part of the modern world. It's this trapped in amber relic that's a throwback to, I don't know, medieval England or something. And it's like, this story is powerful because it's a simple way to kind of explain difference in the sort of exoticism of this place. It's also completely wrong as well, in that the problem with Appalachia, what makes it impoverished, what creates conditions of desperation and poverty, is not isolation, but is connection.
Yeah.
And just really uneven exploitative connections.
Yeah.
Those are taking place at the very moment when Red Dead Redemption 2 is set.
Mm-hmm.
It's really in the decades after the Civil War that the country discovers Appalachia. And when I say the country, I really mean like large corporations who are really hungry for timber, especially, and coal. Right? Like timber and coal are so important to the functioning of the industrial economy at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And they discover that the mountains are full of these resources. And then suddenly it's their job to penetrate this region with railroads and begin extracting it, sucking it out, right? I mean, removing it from the region, often not for the benefit of the people who live there. And in order to rationalize and justify all of this, that's when we see the invention of the stereotype that, oh, well, Appalachia is poor because it's backward.
Right.
And it's really fascinating. Like, you actually don't see the word hillbilly like used until the year 1900. 1900 is the first year that we have evidence of the word hillbilly in print.
Yeah.
And at that moment is like when Appalachia is being swarmed by these external powers who are trying to enrich themselves in any way possible, cutting down forests,
Yeah.
Blowing apart mountainsides to get at the coal underneath, and showing Appalachia as this, place that's always been poor, that's always been, backward,
Yeah.
it justifies the continuation of that process.
It's an excuse. Right.
Yeah.
We're not exploiting these people.
They need exploitation, right? That's the story, right? They need us. The New York businessmen are the ones who are going to save Appalachia, when in fact they created many of the problems to begin with. And here the game cuts two different ways, because the game, yes, it does recycle some of those old school stereotypes of the kind of the bearded, shoeless, toothless sort of mountain man.
Yeah.
You see that in the game.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, the game also shows the realities of the economic harnessing of this region
Mm-hmm.
through Leviticus Cornwall, right? That same robber baron that we see in the West.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guess what? He's the one who runs the coal mining plant
Yeah.
in southern Appalachia in the game.
Yeah.
So the game, it cuts two ways. I mean, on one hand, I'm really disappointed with how the game
Yeah.
relies on all those old stereotypes. So we shouldn't be that surprised, because Rockstar, the company that made this game, has a long history of lampooning white Southerners and poor white Southerners especially.
Well, I think if you ask most Americans, this would be the view that they have. Another big problem we have is we're not that well versed in our own history. And it is absolutely fascinating. There are all these amazing, super colorful characters. There's always conflict. There's always political, social conflict and battles and heroic people and so on and so forth. One thing that you talk about that I found to be extremely ugly were the company towns and how these coal miners were in regions that were kind of out in the boonies near these mines, and they were organized into company towns, which were almost like virtual prisons.
Yeah, they're like medieval fiefdoms, basically run by like a manor lord.
Yeah, all their supplies and so on had to be bought at the company store because there's nothing nearby. And basically, they're trapped and they're not making any money because it's all going back into the company through the company store and so on and so forth. And just really such an exploitive practice, and one that was not outlawed, that the government was allowing to happen, which again shows how throughout our history, government has sort of colluded with the big corporate interests.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're struggling with that now.
It's true. I'm sure that there are corporations in America today that would be thrilled to recreate some of the dynamics of the Appalachian 1920s company town, because it's a powerful means of social control, right? Of creating the conditions for this pliable workforce that will do what you tell them without fighting back. Knowledge of history helps people overcome that. I think that's one of the reasons why Americans don't have such a good grasp of their history, because some of the folks running this country would prefer to have it that way, because an ignorant population is a more easily governable population.
Absolutely. You even extend this theme into the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys, which is fascinating because there's another story where the way it's told to us, it's just like these backward, unintelligent people who get into this feud just because they don't like each other or over some stupid little thing. And then how it extends, and they just go through generations, killing one another. And we sort of like laugh at them and feel sorry for them. Like, oh my God, like what's wrong with these people? But when you examine it the way you have, it also has an economic basis.
Yeah, it's a very modern dispute. The Hatfields and McCoys. Like, there is nothing about this that is like, medieval feuding culture of like knights and chivalry. No, that has nothing to do with them. This is a fight about capitalism and the way that it impacts different people in different ways.
Yeah.
It's a fight about who benefits in the midst of a capitalist boom and who loses.
Yeah.
And yes, it does get violent, but it's not about family loyalties or about trapped in amber holdovers from
you insulted my sister type of thing.
Yeah, that's not what it's. I mean, the conditions of the Hatfield and McCoy violence is something that could very much happen in the 21st century, and not just in Appalachia, anywhere in the country.
Yeah,
because there's all sorts of scenarios to play out. So we need to take these moments that are so shrouded in mythology and rescue them from that to understand what they can tell us today, which is actually a great deal.
Absolutely. And that theme comes through in your book, which for me makes it so valuable, because you see through the lens of this video game and comparing the events in the video game to the real social and political environment that they took place in. You see this theme of sort of expanding capital and expanding Wall Street and big money from the East, seeing opportunities in these different regions and taking advantage of them, but not thinking in terms of the people or improving their lives or even enforcing changes that have happened in terms of the South and the Civil War. They don't seem to have any regard for that. They're just strictly exploitive.
Yeah.
What makes us more money.
Right. I'm very thankful to you for your kind words and for your very close reading of the book too. But, I really do believe that this book is very timely. And that might sound totally weird because it's a book about 1899 as reflected in a video game, But, we're living through a moment that is eerily similar to 1899.
That whole idea of casting the story, like setting the narrative to sort of cover up your misdeeds. It's so important, the telling of history and getting it right and being honest about what really happened. Otherwise, we're led astray and we'll never get to these core issues that formed our country and continue to form our country.
Right. The stories we tell about the past are not just stories. They're incredibly powerful.
They are.
They shape our imagination of what's possible in the present and what's necessary in the present.
Yes.
And that's why we need to take a great deal of care in making sure that those stories have some rooting in actual reality.
Yeah.
And that sort of, mythologized Hatfields and McCoys or cowboys and Indians or one of these other stories.
Right.
When we recycle those stories, that's not harmless or innocuous. That actually has really damaging effects on shaping our own present day.
What a brilliant idea that you struck upon of using this video game. Do you see more opportunities to do this? Have other people sort of picked up on your idea?
Yeah, and other people were working around this as well before me. I'm not the sole pioneer by any means, but I do think that what's somewhat different from with this book and what other scholars have done is that this book, it's really aimed at regular people. Like it's aimed at just people who are fans of the game, or you don't need a deep training in history. I really assume that you're not coming in with much prior knowledge. I mean, I'm sure many
Right.
people will, but I'm expecting to kind of walk you through some of the basics here. So in that sort of public facing work here, I think this book is not unique, but it is kind of on its own in some ways. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to use digital games as a teaching tool to make for fun, accessible, engaging, and meaningful dives into not just American history but world history. There's so many opportunities because I mean, digital games are not a fad. They're not about to go away. They're only going to expand so much more dramatically. And I mean, the world of games in, let's say, 20 years, it boggles the mind to even think what it'll be like. I mean,
Yeah.
So we need to recognize that this is a thing that's here to stay.
Yeah.
And that it's a tremendous opportunity because so many millions, if not billions, of people, their primary engagement with history comes through this medium. So whether we're historians or educators or just someone who cares about the state of the world and our country, we need to jump on that in a couple different ways. Like I think we need to meet students where they are and use things like this as teaching tools, but then we also need to get smart, thoughtful, educated people into the development studios to help make these games even better than they are. And I'm not saying that they're not there already.
Absolutely.
There's lots of amazing, storytellers and
Right.
really educated and thoughtful people who are in these stories. But the age when like the coders and the graphics designers get to make the stories, we need those days to be over. Like we need people who are trained in literature,
Yeah.
in anthropology,
Absolutely.
in history, to be the people making those stories so that they don't recycle these old stereotypes and cliches of the past.
Yeah.
We really need to get the humanities, right? Like all these different fields that study the intricacies of the human condition.
Yeah.
We need them in the dev studio crafting these games. And it's already happening, to be sure. I'm sure Rockstar in making this game relied on a lot of scholars. I don't know the details because they're very closed about their process, which is cool.
Sure.
No problem with that.
They've done an incredible, incredible job, and it keeps getting better. I mean, you enter these worlds, you can lose track of reality, and you're personally experiencing it and following it. But as you say, it can be used sort of to higher purpose, if you will, because if you honestly and carefully and artfully render the political, the economic, the subtleties, these games can be even more immersive. And at the same time, people are actually experiencing history through the eyes of these characters in the games. I mean, what is a more powerful tool than that?
Yeah, though it's hard. It takes hard work, right? I mean, with a good photograph, you can, if you have a photograph of an 1889 cattle frontier town, you can recreate that in a game, with good art team and designers and all that sort of thing. But to get at that human element of like, what did people care about at the time? What made them tick? Well, that you can't get in a photograph. You actually have to read, you have to engage, you have to delve deeper. And I think, the Red Dead Redemption 2 does an amazing job with that visual, aesthetic, architectural look. And it does a pretty okay job on that sort of human texture.
Hmm.
But, future games could take it in
A whole different
many other
dimension.
directions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, like, I'm not a total stickler for like historical accuracy in every possible way because those games would not be fun.
Right.
Like, and what makes video games so attractive is that they're fun and that they're not completely realistic in every way. But,
Right.
you can do away with some of the accuracy stuff and just get more at thoughtfulness,
Yeah.
right? Like capturing the feeling and the mood of a time,
Yeah.
not the exact accent or the exact, like we don't have to get things so nitty gritty correct.
I mentioned that I'm working on a video game in
Yeah.
basically the same kind of capacity. They came to me. So the game creators are interested in this. They're open to this. They sort of see the same weakness or vulnerability of their game. Like, I mean, they can recreate a forest with every blade of grass and it moves as you walk through and the light changes. I mean, it's incredible. But creating that accurate social, political context, historical context is something that they haven't invested as heavily in. And I think some of them, at least, are starting to do that.
I think more developers are recognizing that there's a great deal of fans who want that, like
Yeah.
knowing that it's an investment.
Well, it engages them deeper.
Right.
Yeah.
Knowing that this is a big investment, knowing that AI can't do it for you, right? That this is a human labor,
Right.
first and foremost. You have to know. I mean, these are, commercially oriented companies who want to make a profit, and I get that. They have to make sure that this is worth their investment. And I think games like Red Dead 2 are proving that people really care about that fine-grained texture, right? The fact
Yeah.
that like they're going to read the newspapers that are published in the game, right? These fictional newspapers of which there's like dozens and dozens of copies, dozens of issues in the game.
Yeah.
Sure, not every player reads them, but enough of them do that,
Yeah.
that investment in the sort of, the lived texture of a moment really, really is worth the money.
Yeah.
I'll say, Ralph, I'm quite jealous of you getting to do this writing consulting for video games. It's something that I'd love to do at some point. I mean, I'm not planning on quitting my day job, to be sure, but I'd love an opportunity to consult and help shape the sort of game vision of a game
Yeah.
like this. So I'm eager to see what comes out of your partnership.
I think it will happen. The game makers, I'm sure they'll be interested in your book.
One really fun crossroad into the game world that I've made is with the audiobook version of Red Dead's history, because it will be narrated. And when this book comes out in August, it'll be narrated by Roger Clark, who is the actor who plays Arthur Morgan, the main protagonist
fantastic.
in the game. And he's reading the book
Great.
largely in character from the game. So given that many fans of the game are deeply invested in this voice,
Yeah.
I mean, they've spent countless hours listening to him, as he's taming his horse and engaging with strangers. So to basically appoint Arthur Morgan as your new American history teacher, which is what this audiobook does,
Yeah.
I think will be really, really fun for a lot of gamers.
I think so too.
Yeah, I was in the studio with Roger just about a week ago in New York.
Wow.
When we were recording the audiobook. And for me to hear the words that I wrote coming out of his voice in that particular voice
Wow.
was really,
What a thrill.
yeah, it sent shivers down my spine. He's just, I'm very thankful too, because Roger Clark, not only is he an incredible actor from this game, but he's also done dozens and dozens of audiobooks. So he's a veteran.
Yeah.
He's really good at reading these things. So Ralph, when you get your copy and you get to hear it too, in addition to reading it, I think it might even resonate more.
Yeah. I look forward to that.
Yeah. So if Arthur Morgan can teach someone that the Hatfields and McCoys are really a conflict about corporate capitalism, that to me is an achievement right there.
I think he will. Well, congratulations. And I wish you all the best with the book. It's an important book. I very much enjoyed reading it and learned a lot from it. And I hope other people do too. Best of luck. I think you've opened a whole new field here. Be interesting to see how it develops.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. Those words are really, really meaningful coming from you. It really means a ton to me. And it means even more that you'd have me on the show and have such a delightful, really fun conversation this past hour. I think when I started, I didn't realize how truly timely it was going to be, but the more I delved into it, I was like, wow, this is really a book about the 21st century by way of 1899.
History is so interesting, and you learn so much about everything from history.
Really, Ralph, I can't thank you enough for reading the book so closely. Like, you didn't skim this thing, you really read it.
What's more interesting than the history of human beings, whatever country it is, whatever situation it is? I mean,
yeah,
fascinating. Describing the reaction to the students of the history classes he teaches based on Red Dead Redemption 2, Tore says, the ability of the students to digest and soak up really complicated and intricate material is significantly higher in this class than in other classes, just because they're emotionally present. They're checked in. They're dialed in a way that's not always the case in my big survey classes here at the university. Many of the students are not history majors, but people are coming from computer science and business and communications, and what brings them here is the love for the games, to be sure, but it's also the curiosity and passion and thirst for real historical knowledge that the games inspired in them. Video games are so powerful at instilling that curiosity and passion in people. The games themselves usually can't provide the full story, but they can at least get people fascinated and interested in learning more about it. Tore has certainly made an important discovery about this powerful tool. For tens of millions of fans of Red Dead Redemption 2, his course and now his book are an excellent way to expand their knowledge and interest in this formative era in American history and dispel previous misconceptions. I thank Tore for his important and entertaining book and recommend it highly. It's my great honor to name history professor and author Tore Olsson as today's hero behind the headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines. Executive producer Ralph Pizzullo. Produced and engineered by Mike Dawson. Music provided by Extreme Music. For exclusive content, please join our Patreon group at patreon.com/heroesbehindheadlines.